The city of Chicago in the spring of 1924 was a place of stark contrasts and rapid transformation. It was the era of the Roaring Twenties, a time characterized by a booming economy, the rise of jazz music, and a shifting cultural landscape. In the affluent enclaves of the city, particularly the South Side neighborhood of Kenwood, all families of immense wealth lived in opulent mansions, insulated from the gritty realities of the industrial metropolis. It was within this world of extreme privilege and elite education that one of the most heavily scrutinized criminal investigations in American history would unfold. This is the story of a tragic loss, a community shattered, and a landmark legal battle that forever altered the intersection of criminal justice, forensic science, and psychology. At the center of this narrative is a 14-year-old boy named Robert Franks, known affectionately to his family and friends as Bobby. He was a bright, energetic young man with a promising future, whose sudden disappearance would expose a deeply disturbing reality about arrogance, morality, and the illusion of the perfect crime. Bobby Franks was the son of Jacob Franks, a highly successful and wealthy Chicago businessman. The Franks family was well respected in the Kenwood community, living a quiet life defined by comfort and high expectations for their children. On the afternoon of May 21, 1924, Bobby was walking home from the Harvard School for Boys, an elite preparatory academy located just a short distance from his residence. He had spent the afternoon umpiring a baseball game and was making his usual trek through the familiar, tree-lined streets of his neighborhood. He never arrived home for dinner. When evening fell and Bobby was still missing, a profound sense of panic began to settle over the Franks household. His parents contacted his friends, neighbors, and the school, hoping for a simple explanation. But as the hours ticked by, the terrifying reality set in that their son had vanished without a trace. The following morning, the agonizing silence was broken by the arrival of a typed ransom note. It was delivered through the mail to the Franks' residence and contained a chillingly clinical demand. The letter was composed in a highly formal, almost detached tone, demanding the sum of $10,000 in unmarked bills in exchange for Bobby's safe return. The instructions for the delivery of the ransom were extraordinarily complex, involving a sequence of phone calls, telegrams, and a precisely timed drop-off from a moving train. The perpetrators, who signed the letter as George Johnson, made it explicitly clear that any deviation from their instructions or any involvement of the police would result in immediate tragedy. Jacob Franks, desperate to save his son, immediately began gathering the funds and prepared to follow the labyrinthine instructions to the letter. He was a father willing to sacrifice everything to bring his boy home. However, before the intricate ransom exchange could be completed, the investigation took a devastating turn. In a desolate, marshy area near Wolf Lake, roughly 20 miles south of the Kenwood neighborhood, a group of workers made a tragic discovery. Concealed within a railway culvert was the body of a young male. Authorities were immediately summoned to the scene, and it was soon confirmed that the victim was the missing 14-year-old Bobby Franks. The medical examination revealed that the victim had sustained fatal injuries shortly after his abduction, meaning that the elaborate ransom plot was a cruel deception from the very beginning. The discovery shifted the focus of the police from a frantic rescue mission to a complex homicide investigation. The Kenwood community was paralyzed by shock and grief. The idea that such a calculated and ruthless act could occur in their quiet, affluent neighborhood was incomprehensible. The investigators were faced with a daunting task. The perpetrators had taken great care to conceal their identities and obscure their tracks. The crime appeared, at first glance, to be the work of highly organized individuals who had meticulously planned every detail. But in the history of criminal investigations, there is an enduring truth that perfection is an illusion. Every action leaves a trace, and the arrogance of those who believe they can outsmart the system often becomes their ultimate undoing. In this case, the unraveling of the mystery hinged on a single, seemingly insignificant item left at the scene near Wolf Lake. Resting near the culvert was a pair of horn-rimmed eyeglasses. At first, the eyeglasses appeared to be an ordinary, unremarkable piece of evidence. However, the lead investigators recognized that in a case with no witnesses and few leads, every physical object had to be subjected to the most rigorous scientific scrutiny available. The police took the glasses to a prominent Chicago optometrist for analysis. This marked a pivotal moment in the history of forensic science, demonstrating the immense value of expert analysis in tracking down suspects. The optometrist carefully examined the spectacles and noted two crucial details. First, the prescription was highly specific, designed to correct a particular type of astigmatism. Second, and most importantly, the frames featured a unique, patented hinge mechanism. The investigation into this specific hinge led authorities to the manufacturer, who confirmed that only a very limited number of these specialized frames had been sold in the Chicago area. The police painstakingly tracked the sales records, narrowing down the list of purchasers to just 3 individuals. One of those individuals was a young man named Nathan Leopold. Nathan Leopold was 19 years old, a young man of extraordinary intellect and immense wealth. He was a prodigy who had already graduated from the University of Chicago and was preparing to enter Harvard Law School. He was a recognized expert in ornithology, the study of birds, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of multiple languages. He resided in the same affluent Kenwood neighborhood as the Franks family. When investigators arrived at the Leopold mansion to question him about the glasses, Nathan was cooperative, polite, and entirely unbothered. He offered a highly plausible explanation, claiming that he frequently visited the Wolf Lake area to study and observe rare birds. He suggested that the glasses must have slipped from his pocket during one of his recent ornithological excursions. His demeanor was calm, his alibi was smooth, and his social standing made him an unlikely suspect in the eyes of many. However, investigators were not easily deterred. They began to look closer at Nathan Leopold and his closest companion, 18-year-old Richard Loeb. Richard Loeb was also a child of immense privilege, the son of a vice president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. Like Leopold, Loeb was exceptionally intelligent, having become the youngest graduate in the history of the University of Michigan. The two young men were inseparable, bound together by a shared sense of superiority and a deep obsession with the philosophical concepts of Friedrich Nietzsche. Specifically, they had heavily distorted Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, or Superman. They convinced themselves that their superior intellect elevated them above the laws and moral constraints of ordinary society. They believed they were untouchable, and they had spent months planning what they considered to be the perfect crime, an act committed not for financial gain or personal vendetta, but simply as an intellectual exercise to prove their absolute superiority. Despite their perceived brilliance, their execution of the crime was deeply flawed, and the forensic net was rapidly tightening around them. The police focused their attention on the ransom note that had been sent to the Franks family. In 1924, the science of document examination and typewriter forensics was coming into its own. Experts understood that every typewriter, over time, develops a unique mechanical fingerprint. The keys strike the paper with varying degrees of force. Certain letters become slightly misaligned, and the metal typefaces develop microscopic imperfections. Investigators located a Woodstock brand typewriter that had been used by a study group to which Nathan Leopold belonged. When forensic experts compared the ransom note to a sample typed on the recovered Woodstock machine, the alignment and imperfections matched perfectly. The scientific evidence was undeniable. The typed characters on the ransom demand were identical to the characters produced by the typewriter linked to Leopold. Simultaneously, the alibi that Leopold and Loeb had carefully constructed began to crumble under the weight of basic police work. The two young men claimed that on the day of the disappearance, they had been driving around the city in Leopold's personal vehicle, picking up two women and spending the evening in their company. However, The police interviewed the Leopold family's chauffeur, who stated unequivocally that Nathan's car had remained parked in the garage for the entirety of that specific day. Furthermore, investigators discovered that Loeb had rented a different vehicle under an assumed name on the day of the crime. The physical evidence of the glasses, the forensic match of the typewriter, and the collapse of their alibi created an insurmountable wall of evidence. Under relentless questioning by the state's attorney, the facade of the untouchable supermen finally broke. Separated in different interrogation rooms, the pressure mounted. When presented with the overwhelming evidence, their loyalty to one another evaporated. Each began to implicate the other, attempting to minimize their own role in the actual fatal act, while admitting to the planning and execution of the kidnapping. The confessions detailed a chilling narrative of meticulous planning, a rented car, a chisel used as a weapon, and the tragic selection of Bobby Franks, simply because he happened to be walking down the street at the wrong time. The perfect crime, designed by two self-proclaimed geniuses, had been solved in roughly 10 days through meticulous forensic analysis and relentless investigative procedure. The confessions sent shockwaves through the city of Chicago and the entire nation. The public was horrified by the clinical, emotionless manner in which the two young men described their actions. The press dubbed it the crime of the century. The families of the perpetrators were devastated, their wealth and social standing suddenly a source of national scandal. The immediate public demand was for swift and absolute retribution. The state's attorney announced his intention to seek the ultimate penalty, and given the nature of the crime, the overwhelming evidence, and the complete confessions, it seemed almost certain that Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb would face the gallows. It was at this critical juncture that the families of the accused turned to one of the most famous and controversial legal figures in American history, Clarence Darrow. Darrow was a titan of the courtroom, a legendary defense attorney known for championing the rights of the working class and taking on seemingly impossible cases. He was 67 years old, nearing the end of his career, and exhausted. Yet, he agreed to take the case. His motivation was not to prove the innocence of Leopold and Loeb. He knew they were guilty, and he knew the evidence was insurmountable. Darrow took the case because he was a lifelong, staunch opponent of capital punishment. He saw this highly publicized trial as an opportunity to put the death penalty itself on trial, to argue against the morality of state-sanctioned execution, and to explore the emerging fields of psychology and human behavior in a court of law. Darrow's legal strategy was a masterstroke of courtroom maneuvering. In a move that shocked the prosecution, the press, and the public, Darrow directed his clients to change their pleas from not guilty to guilty. This was a highly calculated decision. By pleading guilty, Darrow completely bypassed the necessity of a jury trial. He knew that a jury, composed of ordinary citizens who were deeply outraged by the tragedy, would almost certainly return a verdict demanding the ultimate penalty. By entering a guilty plea, the burden of determining the sentence fell entirely on the shoulders of a single man, the presiding judge, John R. Caverly. Darrow believed that a seasoned, rational judge would be more receptive to a complex, philosophical, and scientific argument for mercy than an emotional jury. The sentencing hearing, which began in July of 1924, became a monumental event in legal history. It was not a trial to determine facts, as the facts had been admitted. It was a trial to determine the value of human life and the capacity for mercy within the justice system. The prosecution presented a straightforward, aggressive case. They meticulously laid out the facts of the kidnapping, the ransom demand, and the tragic outcome. They emphasized the cold, calculating nature of the perpetrators, their lack of remorse, and the devastating impact on the Franks family. The prosecution argued that if any crime ever warranted the ultimate penalty, it was this calculated act committed by two individuals of immense privilege who knew exactly what they were doing. Darrow's defense, however, introduced a revolutionary approach to criminal law. He brought in a team of early psychiatrists, then known as alienists, to testify about the mental and emotional states of Leopold and Loeb. This was one of the first times in American legal history that psychiatric testimony was used extensively in a courtroom to explain criminal behavior. The defense experts testified that while the young men were legally sane and understood the difference between right and wrong, they were emotionally stunted and suffered from severe psychological abnormalities. They argued that the boys were heavily influenced by their environment, their immense wealth, their social isolation, and their obsessive immersion in dangerous philosophical doctrines. Darrow was not arguing that they should be excused for their actions, but rather that their psychological condition should be considered as a mitigating factor in determining their punishment. The climax of the hearing came with Clarence Darrow's closing argument. Speaking for over 12 hours across several days, Darrow delivered an impassioned, deeply philosophical address that is still studied in law schools around the world today. He did not ask for sympathy for the perpetrators. Instead, he appealed to the judge's sense of higher justice and humanity. He argued that hanging the two young men would not bring Bobby Franks back, nor would it heal the wounds of the community. He framed the death penalty as an archaic, cruel practice that diminished the society that administered it. Darrow spoke eloquently about the impact of the First World War, arguing that society had become desensitized to violence and that the justice system needed to set a higher moral standard. He pointed to their youth, noting that they were legally minors at the time of the crime, and argued that the state should not abandon the possibility of rehabilitation, even for those who had committed terrible acts. He stated that to hang these boys would be to turn the clock back on human progress, to answer cruelty with further cruelty. He asked the court to temper justice with mercy, not because the perpetrators deserved it, but because the justice system itself must remain civilized. After weeks of testimony and Darrow's exhausting, masterful closing argument, the burden rested entirely on Judge Caverly. The public waited with bated breath for the decision. On September 10, 1924, the courtroom was silent as the judge began to read his ruling. Judge Caverly acknowledged the thoroughness of the prosecution and the brilliance of the defense. He stated that he had carefully considered the psychiatric testimony, but ultimately, he found that the psychological evidence was not the determining factor in his decision. Instead, Judge Caverly focused on the ages of the defendants. He noted that while the crime was meticulously planned and carried out with a chilling lack of humanity, the precedent of the court was to consider the youth of the offenders. Because Leopold and Loeb were under the age of majority at the time the crime was committed, the judge declared that he would not impose the ultimate penalty. However, he also ensured that they would never again be a threat to society. Judge Caverly sentenced both Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb to life in prison for the homicide, plus an additional 99 years for the kidnapping. He included a strong recommendation that they never be granted parole. The verdict provoked a massive public reaction. Many citizens and newspaper editorial boards expressed outrage, believing that wealth and a high-priced attorney had allowed the two men to escape the justice they truly deserved. Others viewed the decision as a triumph of progressive legal thought and a step away from the brutality of capital punishment. Regardless of public opinion, the legal proceedings had concluded. The two self-proclaimed supermen, who had believed themselves to be above the law, were stripped of their wealth, their status, and their freedom, relegated to the harsh realities of the Illinois state penitentiary system. Life in prison proved to be a stark contrast to the opulent lives they had previously known. Richard Loeb's time in confinement came to a violent end. In 1936, after serving 12 years of his sentence, Loeb was involved in an altercation with another inmate in the prison showers and sustained fatal injuries. The man who had once believed he was untouchable met a brutal end in the confines of a maximum security facility. Nathan Leopold, however, chose a different path during his incarceration. He dedicated himself to education and reform within the prison walls. He reorganized the prison library, volunteered in the prison hospital, and even participated in medical studies, including volunteering to be infected with malaria to help test experimental treatments during the Second World War. He spent decades attempting to demonstrate that he had changed, that the arrogant, dangerous youth he once was had been replaced by a man seeking redemption. In 1958, after serving 33 years of his sentence and following a highly publicized parole hearing, Nathan Leopold was granted his release. He moved to Puerto Rico, where he worked as a medical technician, married, and lived a quiet, obscure life until his passing in 1971. The legacy of the Leopold and Loeb case extends far beyond the lives of the individuals involved. It remains a watershed moment in the history of American jurisprudence. The case propelled forensic science into the public consciousness, demonstrating how meticulous analysis of physical evidence, from the hinge of a pair of eyeglasses to the strike of a typewriter key, could dismantle even the most carefully constructed alibis. It fundamentally changed the way criminal investigations were conducted, setting a new standard for the preservation and scientific examination of evidence. Furthermore, the trial opened the door for the integration of psychology and psychiatry into the legal system. Darrow's use of expert testimony to explain human behavior paved the way for modern criminal profiling and the consideration of mental health in legal proceedings. It forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about nature versus nurture, the influence of environment, and the complexities of human motivation. The case proved that intelligence and education do not equate to morality, and that arrogance is often the precursor to a catastrophic fall. Yet, beneath the layers of legal precedent, forensic breakthroughs, and philosophical debates, the heart of this story remains a profound human tragedy. The brilliant legal maneuvering and the extensive psychological evaluations can sometimes obscure the most important figure in this entire narrative: Bobby Franks. He was a 14-year-old boy who simply wanted to walk home from a baseball game. His life was cut short, not out of anger or necessity, but as a cruel experiment by those who valued their own egos above the sanctity of human life. The enduring impact of the case is not just in the textbooks of law schools or the annals of forensic history, but in the permanent absence felt by a family and a community that was forever changed. As we look back on this monumental case from the vantage point of history, we are left to ponder the delicate balance of our justice system. The investigation proved that science and relentless police work can uncover the truth, and the trial demonstrated that the law is capable of complex philosophical considerations. But it also leaves us with a lingering thought about the nature of humanity itself. When intellect is completely divorced from empathy, and when individuals convince themselves they are above the moral constraints of society, the results are invariably tragic. As you consider the meticulous forensics, the courtroom drama, and the ultimate fate of those involved, one must ask, does a justice system truly serve its purpose by merely punishing the guilty, or does its true strength lie in its ability to maintain its own humanity when faced with the absolute worst of human behavior?